Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Juneteenth. Welcome to our event today. We're going to start in a few minutes. Okay. All right. So again, good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to Free Your Mind, Advancing Racial Equity in Education. My name is Dr. Monique Swift, by the way, and I'm the current president of the chapter of the Association of Black Psychologists, and I will also be the moderator for our event today. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the New Jersey Association of Black Psychologists, we were established in 1973. And we are a nonprofit organization of psychologists of African descent dedicated to community service, professional development, and addressing issues related to the mental well-being of all residents, but most specifically Black residents in the state of New Jersey. The Association of Black Psychologists sees its mission and destiny as the liberation of the African mind, the empowerment of the African character, and the enlivenment and illumination of the African spirit. We're always seeking to elevate the consciousness of all people toward issues of race, equity, and healing. And it is in this spirit that we organize this event today. So just to give you some context on how we got here, back in August of 2020, Congressman Andy Kim hosted a series of roundtables aimed at elevating the voices of Black people in New Jersey relating to systemic racism and inequality. One such roundtable brought together mental health stakeholders to identify and explore core issues in addressing race equity, race health disparities. I and Dr. Jennifer Jones-Damas, who is also an executive board member of the New Jersey Association of Black Psychologists, were of those invited to that roundtable discussion. Other listening sessions focused on policing, Black businesses, and educational equity, resulting in the report Lift Every Voice. And the full text of that report can be found at a link that will be put in the chat shortly. New Jersey Association of Black Psychologists has long been a stakeholder in the cause of educational equity, and we desire to center this issue on Juneteenth with the hopes of pushing the needle forward toward educational equity for our children throughout the state of New Jersey. So to that end, we are delighted to pull together a very distinguished panel of guests that I'd like to introduce to you at this time. My first guest is Congressman Andy Kim. Congressman Kim represents the 3rd Congressional District of New Jersey, where he was first elected in 2018. Before serving in the House, Congressman Kim was a career public servant working under Democrats and Republicans on international affairs and national security issues. In Congress, he's championed small businesses, veterans, and affordable health care. He lives in New Jersey with his wife and 2 baby boys. Welcome, Congressman Kim. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. We also will be joined shortly by Mr. James Harris. I don't know if you could just alert me if he's joined us, but I'm going to introduce another one of our panelists who's present, Dr. Barbara Prempe. Dr. Prempe is a licensed psychologist and certified school psychologist. She has a passion for educating on the impact of trauma and helping children, adolescents, and young adults develop resilience in the face of adversity. Dr. Prempe is a psychologist and program coordinator of a doctoral level practicum training program at Newark Beth Israel Medical Center. She provides psychological evaluations and treatment for children and adolescents who have experienced abuse, as well as trains and supervises doctoral students. Dr. Prempe is also a consulting counselor at Rye Country Day School, where she promotes awareness of the impact of race-related stress within the school environment. Dr. Prempe has conducted presentations on topics including psychological disorders, trauma, juvenile justice, racial and cultural issues, resilience, and trauma-informed practices. She has a decade of experience in academia, teaching undergraduate as well as graduate courses. And Dr. Prempe is the current Vice President of the New Jersey chapter of the Association of Black Psychologists. Welcome, Dr. Prempe, to the panel. And you are on mute.
Thank you for having me. You would think after what, a year and a half or so of always being on Zoom, I would
yes,
get it correct.
we all still do it. Thank you, Dr. Prempe. The next panelist that I'd like to introduce to you all today is Dr. Crystal Molyneux. Dr. Molyneux is a New Jersey certified school psychologist. She currently works in the Social Emotional Character Development Lab at Rutgers University. She also does group and individual work with students toward the development of self-awareness, self-efficacy, and self-management in hostile adverse situations. Dr. Molyneux also provides therapeutic services to adult individuals who were formerly incarcerated. She is passionate about social emotional learning, restorative justice, empowering women and girls, decreasing systemic racism and oppression, amplifying student voice, and creating and maintaining student support systems, while also using evidence-based methods to build confidence. Welcome, Dr. Crystal Molyneux, to the panel.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. And so we also, have we been joined by Mr. James Harris as yet? Not just yet. Okay, let me just do a quick check-in to see if he's reached out. Okay, I want to introduce him very briefly. Mr. James Harris should be joining us shortly. Mr. Harris holds 2 master's degrees in student personnel service and public administration, as well as a certificate in counseling from Harvard University. He's an active member of the trustee board of Mount Calvary Missionary Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey, president of the New Jersey Association of Black Educators. He serves as first vice president and education chair of the Mount Clear branch of the NAACP. He is active on several boards, including the New Jersey Amistad Commission. Mr. Harris is a longtime civil rights activist and has appeared on television and radio and is a frequent guest speaker at workshops and conferences. Mr. Harris has received numerous awards and recognitions. He and his wife are the proud parents of 2 daughters who are college graduates, and he and his lovely family were selected as New Jerseyans of the Week by the Newark Star Ledger. And again, hopefully we will be joined by Mr. Harris very shortly. Now, as we're just going to jump in, and please be aware that as we go along, we will be entertaining questions and comments from the audience. So if anybody has any questions or comments, please feel free to put it into the chat. And then our behind the scenes person will bring it to our attention and we'll have your question addressed by the panelists. Also, just a little parentheses, we very much appreciate that Congressman Kim was able to join us, but as you can imagine, his schedule is very busy. And so his time with us will be truncated. So if there are any questions for Congressman Kim, please, if you can advance those questions early on, because he will be having to move on to his next engagement before the end of this session. All right, so just to jump in here, today's discussion is about advancing racial equity throughout the state of New Jersey. And to provide us with a little bit of context, according to a ProPublica article, ProPublica New Jersey has the widest racial gaps in the nation. In 2017, a study that was done by the UCLA Civil Rights Project found that New Jersey had the 6th most segregated classroom in the United States. Black students in New Jersey occupy a mere 19% of the seats in advanced placement courses. Black students in New Jersey are 5 times more likely to face out of school suspensions as compared to their white counterparts. Nationally, the rate is 3.9. A recent ACLU report shows that Black girls in New Jersey are 4 to 5 times more likely to be arrested in school than white girls. Another recent study shows that all students fell short of their anticipated academic progress during COVID-related interruptions in learning, but Black and Latino students lost more ground than white and Asian students. Congressman Kim, you cast a spotlight on this very issue in your Lift Every Voice report. What did you learn in your listening session? And are you working on any actionable plans to address this equity issue?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Swift, and thank you. It's great to be a part of this panel. You're right. When I was going around the community, these were the types of issues that we were hearing about, just the struggles of Black students in our schools, also about teachers and diversity within our teaching staff, and there's just so many issues there. Some of it, what we tried to unravel is we're trying to get a sense of what are some of the systemic problems? What are the systemic problems that we have that are causing this type of discrepancy? And what are ones that what are the different levers that we have to try to address this? Some of these things are things that we can try to do on a more community level, county level. Some of these things require the state to get involved and try to address, especially when it comes to curriculum or teachers of color and diversity there with the workforce. And what tools do I have at the federal level to try to address this? And look, we start by trying to understand the problem. So it's so good that you raised this up. That's what we were trying to explore. There's more that we have to do to really understand the data and understand just how deep the problem is. Also, what we need to try to do is figure out, what are some of the early steps that we can take that can have the biggest kind of advantage and the biggest change that can happen. So, we're looking at funding, for instance, at the federal level that can try to help recruit and train up teachers of color to try to make sure that we can have that pipeline, because the last thing we want to hear is excuses from the towns or others saying, well, look, we're not seeing teachers of color applying or things like that. Those are some of the things that we do hear at times, and we just feel like we're not connecting the right people, and we're not making these types of jobs as easy to find and have that diversity of workforce. When it comes to students, this is something that is affecting their daily lives. And I think what's really important is the mindset here, that what we're trying to do in terms of helping give these opportunities and right these wrongs when it comes to inequality in our school systems, especially for our students. That's not just for the students of color. That's not just for Black students to be able to have better opportunities. It will raise up everyone's experience across the board. This is for all students to be able to have a more diverse and more equitable experience there. So we have been engaging with different school districts about that in our district and trying to share some of the lessons learned. But look, it's tough, and we need to make sure that we have all levels of government working together to try to address this.
Yeah. Can you share with us some of the obstacles or challenges that you face in this effort?
A lot of obstacles that we're facing. A lot of it that I'll hear is funding issues, which is why we're trying to address this. A lot of schools that are saying, look, we want to be able to make sure that we have more opportunities, more programming, more ways to be able to address. For instance, you were talking about the inequalities that were happening due to COVID. You're absolutely right that a lot of students of color were ones that were left behind more from the learning loss and the challenges there. We saw huge problems in what we were calling the homework gap, where students might not have access to the broadband access, or we had a lot of families, for instance, especially families that had more financial insecurity, especially families of color. We had a lot of instances where maybe they had one computer at home, but the parent needed that for be able to work from home, so how did we address that? So, these were problems that we were trying to solve through the CARES Act and other federal funding to be able to try to, get funding out there to try to close that gap. So there are certain things that we can do in that kind of way that's better. But when it comes to kind of like larger structural problems, it's like, why is it that we are seeing these kind of patterns of inequality and inequity across so many different school districts? And that's when you recognize it's not just something isolated to this locality or this community, and that becomes harder to address because different townships have their own abilities to control curriculum, school, and hiring and other procedures. So it's harder to have change happen, across the board when one stroke of the pen is not going to be able to address that all. So that's when I have to build coalitions and work with people across different communities to try to share best practices. But it is harder to try to make like that one giant leap when you have to realize you have to make lots of smaller steps incrementally to be able to address some of these problems.
Yeah, I can appreciate that perspective, and I see the challenges that you're sharing, and I thank you for what you're doing. But just very briefly, how, in light of those obstacles and challenges, how optimistic are you in us gaining ground toward race equity here in New Jersey?
Well, I think what I've seen over the last year in particular is a sustained level of commitment and attention to this problem from a lot of folks, that didn't really talk about this stuff before. And so I see this, every single day in my work in Congress, which is important because I was worried. I was worried that the energy from last summer with the rallies and the protests in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, I was worried that was going to dissipate and that we weren't going to be able to sustain it. And, I often say, the opposite of democracy is apathy. If people start to give up and think that they can't make a change, that's when this system breaks down even further, right? There are people that benefit from the status quo, and they're hoping that this energy will just move on and things will kind of settle back down to the way things are. We need to show and demonstrate that we can sustain this attention and this energy to actually make that kind of change and demand that kind of change. So I do feel hopeful, but we can't just assume that it's going to happen. We can't just assume that this change and this progress is going to happen the way that we want, which is why it's so important to have discussions like this one, to keep that attention going and to think about, help us share ideas on how best to be able to capitalize on that energy and convert it into real action.
I understand that. Thank you so much for that perspective. Dr. Molyneux. Sorry, I'm getting a call from Mr. Harris also, so I'm trying to manage that as well. So Dr. Molyneux, can you share with us why educational equity is important in terms of how it affects learning, and also how do you achieve race equity in education?
Yes. So I would definitely say educational equity is very important because it does help students to develop the knowledge and the skills that they'll need to be engaged and also, productive members of society. I really appreciated Congressman Kim's comments about, training early on and, having some training for the staff members and things of that nature, as well as, it even made me think about having change agents within the school for those who are already working in schools who maybe did not receive that training that Congressman Kim was getting at. And I think that is one of the ways that we would definitely be able to achieve educational equity. We definitely want to remember diversifying the school staff, as Congressman Kim was saying. You definitely want to make sure those positions are available. But also it kind of goes back to even, the training that's available and admission into the schools that, qualify, air quotes, those who work within schools, because you have some people who are qualified, but they don't necessarily they don't necessarily have, the pedigree or the degrees behind them and things of that nature. So you definitely want to make sure you have more diverse school staff, but even further, if you go back a little more, diversifying the student population within graduate school settings and higher education. You definitely want to create alternative disciplinary actions. So that statistic that you gave earlier about, Black boys being suspended at higher rates, especially 5 times, at a rate of 5 times more, especially in New Jersey, that's important. That's something to look at, especially the school-based arrest for the Black girls. I've done some work, with Dr. Ann Gregory around restorative justice, and that looks at the system. It looks at, putting into place alternative methods, other than the harsh disciplinary punishments like suspension and expulsion, having restorative conferences, having students become more accountable, have conversations, create understanding. Even these are some ways that we can achieve equity in education, because in training staff members, it opens them up to understanding and getting to know the students, and also increasing empathy to know where their students are coming from, what their backgrounds are. Because if you get to know a student, you'll get to also know what their behaviors are like, what's more like the student, what's less like the student, what may be going on in their background, or within their home life that may cause a particular reaction. But then it also allows staff members to be able to work with students and train them train them and give them the skills around better conflict resolution or increasing their social skills and awareness. I think also, build a support team that includes the community, that includes staff members. Like I said, you do need a change agent, but you also need to bring in the community and people who are important to the students within the school, because, we're in the schools, or some people are in the school, staff members are there, but sometimes it might take a little bit more. And investing that time within the school with students, and, partnering, with the community will help students, get support not only within the school, but also outside of the school. Also, another important consideration would be cultural relevance. So that would look like, lessons within the curriculum that reflect the population within the school. You want to have representation within the school. We always hear that, that hashtag representation matters, but it goes further than just, a spirit week, or, a culture month, of flag day, things of that nature. That has to be something that's ingrained within the system that students feel is important to this, the staff and administration. It's not something for a show. We don't, students don't need performative, they don't need performative justice. They don't need performances and things of that nature. They need to know that, the staff members and people there actually care about them, so that even when, Haitian Flag Day has passed, when, Latinx Heritage Month has passed, or Asian Pacific Islander Month and things of that nature have passed, that these staff members are still going to be here, that these staff members have, put in the work, or, made an effort to have, an understanding. So that kind of leans along cultural competency, but also cultural humility in expanding, your awareness that you don't know it all, but you are willing to learn. You are willing to sit and understand your students who are there. And finally, like I said, some culturally relevant teaching practices. I think that's very important for students, because, traditionally we learn about every other culture. Well, we don't learn about the minority cultures, unfortunately. We learn a lot more about, predominantly, white people within the country, but we have yet to learn. And that kind of taps a little bit into, the debate around critical race theory, and how, they're not really, deciding to, or how some states have already passed legislation around, not teaching about slavery and things of that nature. Black and brown students already don't get enough information about who they were, especially Black students, I'll say, within this country, because for one, we've already been stripped of our African roots and the connection to our heritage. But not only that, we don't learn about it in the places where we are supposed to be poured into and grow. So there's a disconnect, within the country, within the classroom, where students are not getting that information about who they were, who they belong to, and things of that nature. And yes, we can say, it comes from the home and the community as well, but there's something to be said when, wherever you look, your culture is not represented. And then I also think it's important to be aware, that staff members be aware of their own stereotypes and implicit biases. It takes real work, and it takes, being able to be comfortable understanding that we all have implicit biases. No one, is perfect. No one wakes up, in the morning as this perfect person with a full understanding. There are some biases that are at play, but as long as you're working to address them, as long as professional development is happening within schools where these conversations are happening, and there are brave and safe spaces created for staff members and students, we can push forward to some equitable education.
Wow, Dr. Molyneux, you hit so many points. And thank you so much for really kind of bringing us down to the ground with this in terms of like what the experience of what racial equity needs to look like and what type of efforts can help to inform, building and developing this equity within our school system. I heard some symmetry between some of the suggestions that you put out there and some of what came up in the listening session in the Lift Every Voice report. And so it really, to me, highlights the viability of what needs to happen here. And I want to bring you in, Dr. Prempeh, to this conversation. Have you talk about racism and prejudice and how it shows up in the classroom, and what is the psychological impact for students, Black students, and students of all races, if you could speak to that as well.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. Just first in talking about advancing racial equity in education, it's important for the future of all children, especially children of color, right? And I would be remiss if I neglected to acknowledge, of course, as we've done today being Juneteenth, and the first time that we as a nation are celebrating the freedom and liberation of slaves. Let's be clear that Blacks have celebrated this holiday for years, and some even have taken off of work and used their own time to do this. But it's good that now it's not something that we do on our own individually, but now we are able to celebrate collectively as a nation. I acknowledge this because now my hope is that students will be educated on the significance of this day, right? And really understand what this day means for us as a nation. So when we're talking about prejudice and how it shows up in the classroom, we're really looking at implicit bias, right? So with implicit bias, these are unconscious biases, prejudice that we have that's in favor or against one group, person or thing, and things that nature. So we have to be aware of how these biases show up in the classroom. And a lot of the statistics have been mentioned, but I think it's important to reiterate them, right? To really bring it to life. The fact that boys are suspended twice as often as girls. And let's just clarify that it's not necessarily that their behaviors are worse per se, but that they are more likely to be given consequences for their behaviors. And we're looking further into this racially. Black boys who are suspended at twice the rate of Hispanic boys and 3 times the rate of white boys. Those disparities are there. Black and Hispanic boys account for nearly 2/3 of the 3 million suspensions and over half of the 102,000 expulsions in the US public schools. How come? We really have to ask ourselves, why is this happening? And when we're thinking about suspension, the reason why I'm highlighting this is because there has been research that's shown a correlation between the school to prison pipeline, right? A male student of color who's suspended is 3 times as likely to drop out of school by 10th grade and is in turn 3 times as likely to end up incarcerated. So if we're really pushing back at this, looking at it layer by layer, kind of like the whole onion effect, right? Really getting to the core of things, we have to address implicit biases within the classroom. And my counterparts on the panel have already talked about the importance of training and supporting teachers, right? So we don't want to just say that they are at fault. We want to support teachers and we want to support school staff and having them understand and recognize implicit bias and how it shows up. Another piece to this is also how microaggressions tie into this, right, as well. And when we talk about microaggressions, we're talking about, things that are prejudice that are leaked out in our interpersonal interactions with others. And so there's micro assaults, right? And this can be a verbal or nonverbal attack that does have the intent to harm the individual. So a student coming to class wearing a Confederate flag, that is triggering. That could be traumatizing and is it's microaggressive, but it's a micro assault and very blatant, and we're talking about micro insults as well, right? Which is insensitive communication that demeans someone's racial identity. And so an example could be a student's being corrected, certain students being corrected on their grammar, whereas other students are not, right? And expressing that certain students speak a language well and things of that nature. And then micro invalidations, just really ignoring the impacts, the psychological thoughts and feelings of people of color and our experiences. And so I highlight these things because this really highlights the racial trauma that students of color are experiencing in school, right? When we talk, a lot of folks are talking about racial trauma. I really feel like we're neglecting to highlight what our children are experiencing as well on a day-to-day basis in the classroom, where they're sent to learn and thrive, but yet this racially traumatic experiences are inhibiting them from thriving and showing up as best as they can. Because when there's conversations around slavery or other topics, and they identify as that racial ethnic group, if you're in a classroom and you're the only Black person in the classroom, the only Latinx person, it's like sometimes teachers are calling on these students to represent a whole entire group of people. And that's not a comfortable situation to be in. We have to be aware of both of these things impacting students in the classroom and how it's inhibiting their learning experience and their ability to thrive, and how, it's really impacting outcomes as well.
Thank you. I want to come back to you and some of what you said, so we could go a little bit further, but we're going to lose Congressman Kim shortly. And I do want to kind of direct another question to him before he leaves. And in your report, the Lift Every Voice report, it stated that 1 in 5 schools in New Jersey employed zero non-white teachers, and that this student-teacher diversity gap is expected to continue to grow. What's being done and what more can be done, if you will, to diversify the profession of education?
Yeah, thank you. And but before I do so, I want to just thank the other panelists for just the really insightful comments there. I mean, it's just given me a lot to think about as well. Taking some of my initial explorations on this and giving me some more concrete things to consider here. So I just want to say thank you on that front. I also want to just kind of build off of what the doctor was just saying. I was enormously honored to be able to vote in Congress to make Juneteenth a federal national holiday. It's one of the best experiences that I've had in Congress so far, and I hope that is something that tries to show that this is important to all of us. This is important not just to Black families and communities. This is important to every single one of us. And it reminded me of a conversation that I had with students of late, where I had a conversation roundtable with a number of different high school students about race and bias in our communities. I was talking about challenges that the Asian American community has been facing. We talked about some of the issues that the Black community is facing, and the anti-Semitism and other issues, hate in all forms. And I asked a question. I asked all the students, I'm like, is this the first time you're having this conversation, or have you had this before? Is there any place in your school where you talk about this? And everyone shook their head no, that they've never had this before. They never had that kind of experience. So, I just wanted to kind of throw that out there, because I think it kind of gives sort of some builds upon what some of the other panelists said. But Dr. Swift, I mean, what you're getting at when it comes to teachers, it is a huge problem. The sheer number of students in New Jersey that can go their entire school day without having a single teacher of color, without having a sense of that. First of all, again, that affects the kind of education and the kind of understanding that our students will have about teachers, about authority figures, about about just education writ large. But again, it also affects, our workforce. It's clearly something that we have not done a good enough job of as a nation to to make this critically important profession. And I'm a public school student I was a public school student from here in New Jersey. It's such a critically important aspect of our society. We've clearly not done enough to be able to engage there. That means, again, what we're looking at is trying to identify more funding to be able to recruit, to look at how teachers are recruited and how that conversation is happening. Because, we clearly can't just keep going back to the same well that we've been going to, and we've got to find, other places that which we can do that and be very, very engaged upon how we let people know about what it is we're trying to do. Also, this is a conversation that does need to happen at each and every municipality and township and city and effort within New Jersey, because when it doesn't happen in a consistent way, when it doesn't happen with the level of forcefulness that it needs to, again, people think of it as like, oh yeah, like this is an issue and it's a problem, but like we'll try to get to it. We got a lot of other problems, and I think that it always remains like down on that priority list. Whereas like what we need to do is show like, no, look, like this is right up there at the top. This is one of the more fundamental issues that we should be addressing. But so often, when school districts, again, they're going to be pulled in so many different directions. If this is number 15 or 16 on their priority list of things that they should be getting to work on, that means that it's never actually going to be addressed in a meaningful way. So that's something that I've learned, is just trying to find a way to prioritize this and recognize that this is something that is deeply fundamental to the education that our kids are getting. And this is one of the best and most important ways for us to address these issues of racial bias and perception within our community. So that's why, we made this such a big part of that report, and something we're trying to think about how we can help on that. But look, I know I can't stay much longer, but I'm just grateful for this opportunity. I have to say I'm humbled and honored that you talked about the report in the way that you did, and you sent around the link. I hope people have a chance to look at it, and I want you to know that this is not a situation in our office where we did the report and we're like, okay, like we did our part. We are trying to continue this and make sure that we're following up. And we had just an incredibly powerful session. 1 year out from the George Floyd murder, with a bunch of young activists and students here talking about how they feel 1 year later, and we just need to keep at it. So thank you so much for letting me be a part of this.
And we do appreciate you being here. There was a question that was directed to you in the chat. It seems, can you feel that question? Okay, Sakina, can you pull that question up and read it to Congressman Kim, please?
I actually don't see the question, Dr. Swift. Was it to you directly?
It may have been to me directly then.
It might have been a direct message, yeah.
Yeah, it was. Okay, so Congressman Kim, can you speak to the importance of racial coalition building, particularly in the face of increasing racial violence in general, and also anti-Asian violence?
Yeah, look, I think this is critically important. And I think that the coalition building that we've seen, in particular, just the widening of that over the last year was important. As the question kind of implies, yes, there has been an increase in awareness, as well as an increase in actual bias and violence against Asian Americans in this country over the last couple of months. And I have to say, we have seen a level of attention to that in our country that I've never seen during my whole lifetime. And I think a lot of that is because of what happened last summer. I think, what we saw with the heightened awareness of the systemic racism and the inequality and the violence and the discrimination and racism facing the Black community, that has lifted, I think, a lot of sensitivities across the board. And that's important, because, when I think about what we tried to get passed in Congress addressing police reform in our country, that was something that the Asian American Caucus got behind as well. We went to the Congressional Black Caucus and said, what can we do to help? And in that same way, when heightened violence was happening, especially after the Atlanta murders of 6 Asian American women, there was the Congressional Black Caucus that came to me the next day and said, what can we do to help you? And like, it was really wonderful to see that. And it makes us feel less alone when we have these types of attacks, because what is racism and the discrimination? I mean, in some ways it's meant to try to otherize you, try to have people say that they have more power over you. They can make you feel isolated. They can make you feel, unwanted. And, and in Asian American experience, a lot of it comes to belonging, that, making us feel like we don't belong here in America, right? So having that community is so important, and it's what allows us to try to make some progress. So, but it also pushes us to understand how we can be better allies in different ways, stand up against hate in all forms. It certainly affected the way I teach my kids about this. I teach them not just about challenges that people that look like us face in the Asian American community, but again, to stand up against hate in all forms. But it also pushes us to have some uncomfortable self-reflection, to look and understand our own biases and our own privileges, and to understand how that affects the way we look at things and what we talk about. So, I think that is something that has been fundamental to our experience. But I think it's important because I do not think you can actually solve any of these problems without thick allyship and strong coalition building. So, I've seen it in our own community here. That's the only way we've been able to get any progress on this. So I think that was a very thoughtful question, and I'm really grateful to be able to, again, be part of this. So thanks so much, everyone. Thank you for letting me, and please have a happy Juneteenth, and I look forward to hearing about how the rest of this panel goes.
Yes, and same to you. We appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to be with us. We've seen you as someone who leads by example. Certainly after the insurrection that happened at the Capitol is one of those examples. And we appreciate that you are rolling up your sleeves and really digging into this issue. And we hope to continue to support you in this effort going forward. Have a blessed day.
You too, take care.
And Dr. Prempe, we're coming back to you, because you were really hitting some points as it relates to the psychological impact of students. And you were talking about the, students feeling inhibited and that experience of being the only one, right? We've had that experience before, and teachers needing to mitigate that kind of discomfort. What are some specific recommendations or suggestions that teachers can do, educators can do, to address this racial stress and also build more equity within the classroom?
Yeah, so when I speak of implicit bias, I think that's where we first start, right? Is in educating ourselves on these things in regards to our own prejudice that we are aware of and are not aware of. So the educating ourselves, starting with ourselves, is important, and also learning about history and learning about the history of systemic racism and how it impacts people of color across different institutions, right? Even in housing markets and things of that nature. So having teachers be supported by certain professional developments that helps them to be more aware of the information that eventually they will share with their students, right? Understanding culture as it resonates with your students, and really how that impacts. And this means talking about things that are uncomfortable, right? We have to, for change to happen, we have to get comfortable being uncomfortable and having these difficult conversations amongst our peers first, right? And so teachers having these conversations with each other. I'm someone who believes in having an accountability partner, right? If I say I want to change in a certain area, I want to have someone that's going to hold me accountable, right? Someone who can take a stand back and look at how I'm operating, look at how I'm moving, and say, what you just expressed, you said to the student, I don't know, that seemed a little microaggressive. We might want to check that, right? And creating classroom environments where students feel safe in what's being discussed in the class, how their emotions and thoughts are being interpreted and received, right? And so I get it that sometimes it may be difficult for teachers to feel as though, well, I have to manage the lesson and things of that nature. I can't focus on other things. But when we talk about social emotional learning, doing check-ins are important, right? And so just acknowledging and being transparent for students to say that, listen, I understand that, you know, when certain national incidents happen, that we know our students are aware of. We know our students are seeing, whether it's through social media or watching the news. They've seen it. They know what's going on. The insurrection at the Capitol. That next day, students are aware, and then they're in class. Just checking in, right? Doing a feelings thermometer or whatever the case may be, checking it is important. It validates that I know you're feeling a certain way. You don't necessarily have to turn it into a class discussion, or just making a statement that something happened yesterday that I can imagine is on each and every single one of our minds and are bringing up a lot of different emotions. It's doing that for me, and I can only imagine what it's doing for you. So let's just take a minute to center in, take some deep breaths. And although it may be difficult for us to go through the lesson, we're going to try our best to get through this lesson together today, in spite of what happened. That right there models for students, right? When challenging situations occur, we acknowledge how we feel and we try to do our best to proceed. So it's a way of leading by example and still checking in and acknowledging how historical things are impacting students. But teachers have to be supported. We can't just say, okay, do that, but do they feel comfortable acknowledging those things and having those conversations? So it's a two-way street. You know, I don't want to put it all on teachers. I also want to acknowledge that leadership must support them, right? Meaning that there needs to be funding in place for schools to be able to get outside help that'll come in and emphasize the importance of diversity in curriculum and things that nature. We can no longer just say you matter, you can excel. We have to start showing students. We have to start showing them, and when we're highlighting prominent figures in different areas, be sure to get examples where they see themselves as future scientists and things that nature. Like, we can't just say it anymore. We have to go beyond that. So it's really on educating staff. That's important, and acknowledging systemic racism and educating staff on that as well, so that they can appropriately teach students in a well-rounded way. And like I mentioned before, creating safe spaces, right? And really setting ground rules. I do this as a professor because some of these things not only apply to K through 12 educational systems, also in the college setting. I do this as a professor, especially in classes of like multicultural counseling and things of that nature. And in any class, I like to set up ground rules, like I call it. Like, what do we need in this space to be able to have open, honest conversations, right? And then I put up, the mnemonic respect. And from each of these, come up with words that we need. Students will say, we need empathy, we need respect, right? We need transparency. So we put it all up there because I want you to tell me what's needed in this space. And then we as a class acknowledge and respect that we're going to try to uphold these things, understanding that sometimes someone may say something that may hurt, but we also have to have the empathy to be able to hear that, receive that, right, as the person who's done the harm, and then the person who's been hurt, to try to hear the other side as well, right? And that takes skills and it takes time, and that's why, again, support needs to be in place to be able to do that. But that helps. And just imagining from a trauma responsive approach, we don't know what traumas our students have been through, and what topics we're discussing can re-trigger some things. So that's important. Fostering safe school classroom environments is important, and just showing up and modeling, I mentioned it already, modeling our authenticity, right? And so, those are different things that can really help to address and support students in a better way.
Well stated. Thank you. Thank you. And feel free, Dr. Molyneux, that if you want to jump in here and add something, you can feel free to do that by all means. I wanted to expand the conversation a little bit for us to talk a bit about the Amistad Act. And the Amistad Bill came into law in 2002. It calls for New Jersey schools to incorporate African-American history into the social studies curriculums. The legislation also created the Amistad Commission, of which Mr. James Harris, who hopefully will still join us, but was supposed to be on this panel, he is one of the commissioners for the Amistad Commission. This is where I kind of feel a big gap here, because I really wanted him to fill in on what's been happening with the Amistad Commission and this effort. But nonetheless, to date, from 2002, when it became law till now, implementation of the Amistad Act has been inconsistent. It hasn't taken, hold in many districts throughout the state. And so, Dr. Molyneux, what, from your perspective, does the Amistad Act, how does it connect to the broader community?
I think it connects to the broader community and, what was mentioned earlier about, having an understanding of who you are and where you come from. At the end of the day, like you said, it has been inconsistent. And, in, my reading about the Amistad Act and even speaking with others, a lot of people weren't even aware that this even exists. A lot of times, when it comes to teaching about, the contributions of African Americans, it's a very silent or whisper of a conversation. Unfortunately, we get the same, lessons. Students are getting the same lessons about, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and that's great. We appreciate their contributions, but there's so much more out there. There's so much more, that African Americans have contributed to this, to America, and also the descendants of the African diaspora. So I think that there is a disconnect, but I think that in, filling those gaps, I think that it will definitely give students more of a sense of pride, a sense of self, a sense of self-worth. It'll help them understand where they can go. As Dr. Prempeh said, we do need models, not only within our schools and within our community, but we need models that we are learning about within schools to know that I can make it. We have President Obama, and, a lot of people from seeing President Obama, they had those conversations like, I can do it too. We have Vice President Kamala Harris, and now, people are having conversations with their little Black daughter saying, you can be a vice president too. So if we just have those conversations coming from, presidents and vice presidents, think of the conversations that can take place within the home and within the schools when we see, everyday people who are achieving things, bringing in even, even if there's not, you can take it one step further to make the lesson more integrative, bring in people even from the local community who have achieved things, or who have worked to achieve things, or who have gone through school, and speak to students, around, what what it took to get where they're going. We have career days and things of that nature, but let's bring in, more, more speakers who are representative of the student population, and, who can speak to, what it took to get where they are now.
Thank you. And so, and adding to that, Dr. Prempeh, what would you say is the psychological rationale, if you will, for the Amistad Act, and why is it relevant for Black history to be incorporated into the curriculums? And
yeah, I definitely. Sorry, it's important in the sense that we're really educating everyone on the history of Black people, and it shouldn't be, because like Dr. Molyneux mentioned, we usually get these brief snippets when our culture is so large, so rich, and there's so many people that can be highlighted in so many different arenas. And this it reinforces to students of color, I am somebody, right? I have evidence of resilience. I have evidence of excellence. And therefore it motivates as well, right? I can do good as well. And so it really provides examples for us, and then also motivates our students. And one thing I want to touch on is why I keep saying it's beneficial for all children, all students, everyone, is because we see it time and time again where there are instances of ignorance. And when I say ignorance, it's not to use it in a negative way, but to truly use it to and how the word is defined is lack of knowledge of. And we see prominent um, people, white people in high places. And it's always just very sad when there comes out this instance of racism, right? Or something they did way back when, and all that they've worked so hard for is taken away from them. And when they explain themselves, they acknowledge the ignorance that they had at that time. And that's why I think it's beneficial for all of us to be well-rounded and educated on history of people of color, because then you get to better understand the struggle, the injustice, the systematic racism that's out there that makes it more difficult for people of color to achieve at the same rate as our white counterparts, and to be more sensitive to what's said and what's done, so that it's not hurtful and harmful to people of color, which then in turn could potentially cost someone, our white counterparts, their career. So that's why I keep emphasizing that it's beneficial for all children to be aware of these things.
So along those same lines, from a psychological perspective, how does a white student benefit from, certainly it might reduce incidents of bias and outright, racial hatred, right? And that could possibly bite you in the behind later, given the example that you gave. But also in a way, like you really explained very well how how edifying it is for a Black student to see the examples of what has been achieved and what they can achieve to create that vision. Does that same thing happen? How does that impact white children, in the same way, or does it? And I'd like to hear also, Dr. Molyneux, from you on that question, if I could.
I can use the example from, classes I taught in regards to cross-cultural counseling. And when I highlight systematic racism and oppression and things of that nature, it's always good to know that the message came across when white counterparts are able to acknowledge and say, I just didn't realize that it was that tough. I always thought, like, look, if you work just as hard as I do, we'll both get to the same place, right? And then there's examples put in place. There's a video that the APA has, and it talks about a Black student that was in an advanced class in high school. And even on the first day of that class, being in that class, the teacher questioned as to why is she here? Didn't ask anyone else but her. And although later on it was confirmed that she belonged there, she talked about how that impacted her every single day in that class. And for my students to hear that and understand how psychologically having that experience, it makes you distracted. When we talk about the healthy brain and the trauma brain, right? And how it functions differently, and you're not able to be as alert and focus on what's happening now. Those impacts are significant. So really having my white students acknowledge and see that is important, because I feel as though it increases their empathy. And we can't the statement of, oh, just pull yourself up by the bootstrap. Everybody has to have boots.
Right.
Everybody has to have boots to be able to do that. Everybody has to be able to afford boots to be able to do that, right? And I show, some informational things on redlining, and it's like an eye-opening thing to see, and then they reflect on their own experience to say, you know what, now I understand. So it's important for everyone. And psychologically, it really builds greater empathy and understanding. And it does something for my white counterparts that I've been able to fortunately have in my class.
Yeah, empathy is huge. Thank you. Dr. Molyneux, anything on that?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Prinvig. Such great points. I would definitely say it really does open up the awareness of, the white students within schools, and understanding, like Dr. Prinvig said, what everyone what minority students, Black students, and students of color have to go through. Because I think a lot of times, as we all know, we are put in a stereotypical light. And a lot of times, we have that, exception, or as they view it, as the exception of, one particular Black person who made it. So then there's the attribution of that one person that they overgeneralize to the entire population. So using Dr. Prempe's example of the one student in that advanced placement class, white students may see that and say, well, if they can, if this one person can do it, then you all can do it. And that's a gross generalization, amongst or against, Black communities and other communities of color. So I think it really does open awareness. I think it opens up those conversations, kind of going back to what Dr. Prempe was saying. Sometimes, we're not able to, have those conversations. We're only able to kind of check in. But I think when we can have those conversations, that's when it's important, because now you're able to open it up. Now you're able to, understand where another student may be coming from. And you understand, like you said, that meritocracy, unfortunately, is a myth. Like you said, Dr. Prempe, everyone doesn't have the boots. Everyone is not in, the same circumstance. Everyone, even within communities of color, everyone does not start off on the same level. Everyone is coming in at different levels, and everyone has a different background. So I think it really does open up the awareness of the white students, but it also shifts the understanding of, what we go through, because, even if a student does have some difficulty, every student isn't coming from, an impoverished or underprivileged background. Sometimes they are just some circumstantial things, so sometimes you have students who are surprised, to see, another student sitting alongside of them, in an advanced placement class, or in a college, or in a grad school. So just opening the understanding that, we are diverse, within our communities as well. I think that opens that up also. So not only are we moving away from the stereotypes, but we're moving toward the diversity within our communities.
That's right. Thank you so much. So pushing that same kind of understanding a little bit further, how do you then address or mitigate the mentality or the attitude around the thinking that seems to be fairly pervasive in this country, that seems to that white people seem to subscribe to, that is, if you gain, I lose, right? Almost as though there's a fixed amount here, right? And I have the lion's share right now. And yeah, it might be appropriate to share this with you, but if I do, then I lose. How do you kind of speak to that kind of sense or mentality that seems to be in the air here in this country? Whoever wants to jump in. Again, still along the same lines as dealing with white students and helping them to become partners in this effort toward equity and understanding racial and cultural contributions to this country. Dr. Prempe?
When I hear this question, it makes me think of, and forgive me because I'm blanking on the theory and concept, but it's like it goes way back to the rationality that there's this scarcity of something there, right? You all help me out if you know exactly what I'm talking about. There's this scarcity of something, and therefore it's only a certain amount. And if others is just as advanced as us, they're going to take all of this and things that nature. So it goes way back into, from a theological perspective, more, I believe it's like human evolution and things that nature. Forgive me because I'm totally blanking. Is it Darwinism's survival or whichever nature nurture concept? Forgive me, but it really has to do with that piece there. And I think that's where that stems from. And it's a neglect to see that we would all benefit, and it really has to do with the pushing the narrative of wanting to sustain wanting to sustain superiority in this culture. Because think about it, if you've been a part of a group that have had the benefit and privilege for so long, it becomes comfortable.
That's right.
And the narrative to get you to feel like, oh no, you're being threatened, is to say, But when it's equal for everyone, you're not going to get to have these things. And I'm glad that they're, my white allies and counterparts, some of them are able to say like, no, I'm not buying that narrative that my stance is gonna, who I am is gonna be threatened.
Mhm.
I want everybody to come along further with me. I don't need to always be ahead. So I think that's something to consider as well.
Yeah, yeah, thank you for that. Go ahead, Dr. Molina.
Yes, I think yes, there is a pushing of that kind of fear around, I'm going to lose out, as Dr. Prempe was saying, in terms of, I'm no longer going to be comfortable, my family is threatened, my generational wealth is threatened. But I think that, even in that mindset, there's still a neglect to acknowledge that there are still barriers that, minority and people of color have to overcome in order to even chip at what has been sustained and what is what is long standing and almost self-sustaining within this country. So I think just that pushing with that fear is what's really driving that thought process. And I think, as Dr. Prempe was saying, understanding that coming together will work better than it would rather than keeping everyone separate and keeping everyone on one side versus the other. I think conversations around that definitely need to be had, and having an understanding of what that would mean to you. If you do see your counterpart coming up that's of another race or ethnicity, and how that's a direct threat to you, having students have those conversations even within schools about what they've learned within their families and what they feel about themselves, and then just having them kind of take a survey of the room. You know what I mean? There's no better way to have an understanding than to kind of like look at some statistics, or even just look at what they see around them and what they see within schools, in higher education and the workforce, and having understanding of how not diverse it is, how having an understanding of the disproportionality within the workforce and the education systems.
Yes, yes.
I just want to add, this is why I really want to acknowledge, from our white abolitionists to our white allies, the importance of them speaking up for us in rooms that we're not even in, and it's on them to represent our side, and we have to acknowledge that, because there's been advancements because of that, and that's why we need to ensure that they realize speaking up about the injustice is important. You can't be silent, because silence equates to dismissing. Silent is dismissive as well, right? And so when you do speak up, even to be the person to say, something doesn't seem right about this, helps people to start thinking, right? And so I really want to acknowledge that, again, from our white abolitionists to our white allies, the importance they've had and the role they've played in helping to progress us in places that we weren't even able to be in.
Yes, yes. So I see comments. The conversation is getting very, very rich. Thank you so much for your perspectives on that. And please, I invite those of us who are watching to jump in the conversation, if you will. If you have a thought, feedback that you want to share, please feel free to put it in the chat. And if there are any particular questions that you have for our distinguished panelists, if you can put that in the chat as well, so that we can continue to engage here. We're talking about the Amistad Act, and Dr. Molyneux, how does the Amistad Act relate to your work as a school psychologist, and what can a school psychologist, what can you do on the ground internally, in-house, to promote traction with the Amistad Act within your school?
Mm-hmm. So I think first, I would definitely start with, working with staff members, and having them, be prepared to have these conversations. Because a lot of times when we introduce new programs, or even though this this one isn't as new, but a lot of times when we introduce programs within schools, a lot of times what staff feedback tells us is that they don't feel prepared. They don't know how to have these conversations. So I think preparing staff members to have these conversations, understanding how to integrate it, within their work, would be the first step to incorporating the Amistad Act, especially for myself as a school psychologist, helping staff members feel comfortable, helping them feel comfortable having those conversations and understanding ways that they can respond if there's pushback. Also, even preparing, within the school, if there's pushback from, parents and things of that nature around, the increase in, the discussions around African Americans and their contributions, with throughout history. I think secondly would be definitely some social emotional learning, just kind of incorporating that into the curriculum and having those conversations, with students. So, as Dr. Prempe was saying, having those check-ins with the students, but not only that, but switching the curriculum from an instruction based to a more integrative approach, within the classrooms, having students, speaking with students and having them bring in their own ideas and people that they would like to discuss, throughout history, people that they've learned about. So, once again, kind of going back to staff and supporting them with ways that they can incorporate, these conversations and how they can go about implementing this, throughout the school. I would also say, thinking about administration and how they can do more besides, the, SEL week or cultural awareness week, as I was spoke about earlier, really integrating it and within the school system so that these are constant conversations within the school system, within classrooms. And I think also just keeping in mind, some of the practices that are going on. So as I said earlier, some representation, bringing to staff's awareness, some how we can enhance representation within the classrooms, within the curriculum, and incorporating more about history within the curriculum. I think about, math and science specifically, because I feel like a lot of times, when we talk about these conversations, a lot of times, people tend to go more towards social studies or English, but you can also incorporate this, within, science and math, thinking about, the early scientists and mathematicians and things of that nature, and just briefly, introducing it, to students before you start the lesson on whatever concept that you're going into. So it doesn't have to be a grand, festival or anything of that nature, but it can be just small steps, that we begin to take to really build out, it out within the system, because ultimately we want it to be ingrained. And we know sometimes we have to take some of those smaller steps in order for it to be ingrained before we try to take some of those bigger leaps for the acknowledgement of, African Americans and their contributions to history.
Very interesting point. And so with having your feet on the ground, what are you encountering in terms of the mentality or attitude? What is the buzz around the Amistad Act, or is there any buzz?
I would say there's not much buzz, unfortunately. There isn't much buzz, but specifically in the schools that I've worked with, I would say there's variance. So, you have, some schools that I've been a part of, there isn't acknowledgement, there isn't even acknowledgement of Black History Month, and then I have other schools where there is acknowledgement of, Black History Month, Latinx Heritage Month and things of that nature. And I would say that, for the schools where I've worked where there is acknowledgement of it, I just, tend to support it and come up with different ways of how we can continue it and, push it forward and expand it going forward. And then when it comes to the schools that I've been in where there isn't any acknowledgement, I'm making my point, especially when I'm doing groups within the classroom, to integrate it. So when we had, Black History Month, I started off our groups with, quotes from, prominent figures in Black history, but even not as prominent figures, because as I said, we get the same people all the time that we learn about. So I started incorporating some quotes and then asking students to give feedback about how that quote applies to them, or how they can apply it in their lives to others within the school or within the home. Because for me, I'm very, I feel that in order for students to be successful, I feel that there is a need to really tie together school and the home, school and the community. We can't just focus on one. They are intertwined. And if we want our students to be successful, we want them to think about how they can apply these lessons that they learn, not only within school, but outside of the school, and how they can then they themselves become change agents and encourage their friends who may not go to their school, or encourage their cousins, their family members, their parents, their grandparents, things of that nature. So for me, I would say, you know, I try to, I don't want to say sprinkle it in, but depending on where I am at the moment, I might have to sprinkle it in. And then other times I'm full on support, you know, with my bullhorn.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I think I think it's definitely important to raise it any way you can, or as much as you can, I would definitely say. And I would say for those who feel a little more shy about it, I feel that, there are ways that you can do it where it doesn't have to be, like I said, a grand production. It could be something small where you just check in, or it can be just something as simple as a quote, or just, having like a little spotlight in the moment in the classroom where a teacher can just, spotlight, a particular person and then go on with the lesson.
Definitely. Thank you for that. And from your earlier point, I appreciate a point that you made as it relates to, that, it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be put in a box, this Black history and contributions that Black people have made to this country and so forth, that it can be woven into mathematics. It can be woven into, there's nothing really that any discipline that can be taught that this cannot roll into the idea of, the contribution or the issues or what have you. And so I really appreciate that point, because I am of the perspective that we have to also kind of grow beyond, okay, this is the race issue over here, and then this is the rest of the world. And so thank you for that point as well. It was one of our guests commented that it was an interesting point that was made, that they recently learned, this is Dr. Bowling, that every person who wrote the person who wrote the Lift Every Voice and Sing was our national anthem, was a white abolitionist. And thank you for that, because I did not know that. And they wrote it related to dealing with their own feelings about his role in racial oppression. Interesting fun fact there. Thank you for sharing. And so it was mentioned earlier about critical race theory. I think Dr. Molyneux, I think you referenced it. And given all that's going on right now, we can't really have this conversation and not look at critical race theory and the role that it's playing right now. We saw recently the Texas governor, Greg Abbott, recently signed into law a bill that was aimed at preventing teachers from talking about racism. And this is really part of a nationwide, as we're seeing now, effort to enact laws that prevent teachers from teaching critical race theory. Texas was the 5th state to pass this law, and there are currently a dozen of other states who are looking at the same thing. So under this particular law in Texas, just a few items. Teachers can't talk about discrimination or the idea that some receive adverse treatment solely or partly because of the individual's race. They can't talk about the advent of slavery that and how it was central to the growth and development of this country. They can't talk about slavery and racism as anything other than deviations from, betrayals of, or failures to live up to the country's founding principles. They can't talk about the concept of meritocracy, as was mentioned earlier, and how that feeds a racist narrative, right? So these, among other things, are just kind of some of the things that is being banned from us being able to discuss in the schools. And so just days ago, here in New Jersey, in Dwight Englewood, a private college prep school here in New Jersey, a teacher resigned, claiming that she was being forced to teach critical race theory. Earlier this year, Governor Murphy signed a law requiring schools to highlight and promote concepts of unconscious bias, economic disparity, and their implications on individuals and society at large. How, Dr. Molyneux, you're in there and you're kind of seeing what's going on the ground. You're dealing with teachers. How ready do you think teachers are, and how equipped are they and administrators to address racially disparate conditions and this idea of critical race theory? And given the climate that is around critical race theory, do you think it's going to pose a threat to any traction that we would want to gain, the Amistad Act to gain as well?
So I will answer the second question first. I absolutely do believe that, banning the critical race theory definitely would, it would slow down the efforts of the Amistad Act. It pretty much would kind of bring them to a halt, I would say, or it would be a great gap in the understanding, I would definitely say, of our students. And I think in terms of preparation, I honestly lean towards no in terms of preparation, only because, when we have these conversations around race and biases and, stereotypes and discrimination, things of that nature, it evokes a lot of emotion. And a lot of times, people struggle with, I don't want to say separating the emotion, but being able to have conversations or productive conversations without letting the emotions take over. So of course the emotions are going to be there, and that's perfectly fine for the emotions to be there, but we also need to have a productive conversation. And so that's why I say that, there is a little more work to be done for staff members around having these conversations and, bringing, discussing race and things of that nature. There definitely needs to be more in terms of, I would say, professional development. I just keep kind of going back to that because you really want staff members to be comfortable having these conversations and being uncomfortable, as Dr. Prempe noted earlier. These are not comfortable conversations. We have them, sometimes within our own, within our own families or within our own circles and things of that nature, and we know how it can go. So thinking about it, within schools, within the professional setting and things of that nature, I think that a lot needs to be done to really, really support staff members in their ability to have these conversations, the ability to bring in, the facts at the end of the day, and also validate the students, because students are going to have emotions, staff members are going to have emotions, but you definitely want to validate what the students are feeling, what comes up for them, and being able to navigate it. So I would say, like, as a school psychologist, I would say you definitely want to have school psychologists present or some other mental health professional present to help, facilitate these conversations, help validate it, keep it from, really spilling over. And then just also having that empathy that Dr. Prempe talked about earlier, just having that understanding of where the other person is coming from. In one particular social emotional learning activity that I've done with students is called the respectful debate, where students debate either side of the issue, but not only do they debate the side of the issue, they then switch to the other side to gain some perspective. Even if they don't agree, they still understand. It helps them to understand why a person might think that way or why these points might come up. So I think even doing some of that with staff members will really help prepare them to have these conversations. But I think, I think emotions are going to be there regardless, but I think how we respond to those emotions and how we support the staff and students will really push us forward. But I would definitely say start with the staff first, because they are really going to need the support.
Great points. It's such a charged issue, and it is really dividing the country right now, this whole thing of critical race theory. I feel like, and Dr. Prempe, if you can respond to it, that there's long been an effort. As we said, the Amistad Act was signed into law in 2002, right? And here we are, how many years later? And so, do you think that the idea of incorporating Black history into the curriculums is going to get conflated with this controversy around critical race theory right now? And can you really fully separate these two ideas? Any thoughts on critical race theory and how it connects with the Amistad Act? And you're on.
Sorry, I did it again. It's really about our acceptance of the harsh truth of the American history, right? And is everyone really ready to accept the harsh truth, even if it makes you, meaning you because you're attached to a group of people, look bad for a bit? And I believe that that's where the reluctance is, right? Because, oh no, if we teach them about the harsh truth, is there going to be an outrage? You know what I mean? And like, is there going to be a backlash? And it's not about that. We cannot deny the truth of things. It's important that we acknowledge it. And so, if you're just thinking recently, why is it that now we're talking about Black Wall Street and the Tulsa massacre? It's unfortunate that, what is it, 100 years later, now we're recognizing it and people are just learning this. And it's doesn't want to be talked about because that really acknowledges the hatred for the progression of Blacks, right? And so I really feel as though there's work around that in regards to, critical race theory. It requires a level of empathy, a level of truth and honesty and transparency, critical thinking, and emotional intelligence that everyone just may not have reached that point yet, but we have to get there. It's beneficial to acknowledge the oppressions, the hardships that's happened, and to kind of sweep it under a rug or to tell the narrative differently. It's just, it's an injustice. It really is, and it's just not fair to acknowledge the truth.
Yeah.
So psychologically, it's kind of as if we're going with this delusion of things, and it's not fair because it again is dismissive of the experience of people of color. It's very dismissive of the experience of people of color.
Yeah, I kind of think of it as, an active cognitive dissonance that is being experienced here. Why do you think it's so, Dr. Pumphrey, why do you think it's so threatening to white people to, be honest about the history of this country and the history of slavery and white privilege and all of the other race-related issues that feed into that?
Yeah, I mean, I can only respond with my assumption of things would be, it's just pulling a curtain or calling out what the reality of things, right? And it's, the threat shouldn't be there if you are aware of your privilege and are doing something to support others. I really feel like the threat is only there when the individual is attached to sustaining the system for their own benefit. What we've talked about earlier, you know, um, it would be good to have a difficult conversation between our white allies and counterparts who are on different sides to really hear that opinion and see what's going on. It's hard for me to understand, and that being transparent is hard for me to understand because of who I am, right? The other side of things. So I will acknowledge that up front, that it's really hard for me to see the other side, but I definitely love hearing what others think. It's important. It educates me, right? I can't just have my blinders on and say this is it. I want to hear the other side too. So the only assumption that I can come up with that it's a threat to privilege and rights that they feel, that they may feel that they should always have. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And if I could jump in too, I think it's also a threat to the image of America. America likes to boast as, the land of the great, the home of the free, the land of the brave, when that's not true. And, America just has a history of, just really dismissing and erasure at the end of the day. Because if we think about how this country was founded, if we go back to, Christopher Columbus and things of that nature, I can speak from my own experience. I didn't learn about Christopher Columbus and what he truly did until I got to college. So let's think about all the students who graduated high school who didn't learn about Christopher Columbus and didn't go to college, and where their education about this country ended. You know what I mean? And then we just, you know, like I said, thinking about how America boasts and how, you know, they talk about how we're so advanced, we're, you know, a first world country and all these things, where we, you know, we're the place that everyone wants to be. And that's because there is a purpose, there's a purposeful erasure and unacknowledgement of our, not our, but of the country's, you know, gross past and what they've done to many countries and what they're continuing to do even now that we're still not discussing. And just even thinking about, you know, not just what they're doing, you know, to other countries, but even what they're doing right here within our country and how they continue to oppress and how they continue to maintain, you know, the privileges that are afforded to others, or the majority as opposed to the minority. So I think that also plays a big part into where we are right now. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. What do you think would happen? And anybody, you made me think as you were talking, you know, what if the truth was told? You know, what if this, you know, just hypothetically speaking, you know, we were honest, you know, and we did take an honest appraisal of who we are in this country and where we've come from. And is there any real harm? Certainly, I think there's a psychological threat. But what are the implications of that if the truth were told?
It's funny, I just want to touch on what Dr. Maloney expressed earlier. When I learned the truth behind Christopher Columbus, I felt so betrayed. Like, why didn't they teach me the truth in school? That's how I felt, right? I really felt that. So, you know, in line with the question you just asked, like keeping people in the dark or portraying a certain image for so long, people will feel betrayed.
Yeah.
Right. And we'll act in certain ways, negating that, you know, me walking around highlighting, celebrating this person is hurtful and triggering and traumatizing to a certain group of people. Right. And if I would have known that, I mean, I just felt so betrayed. I don't know how you felt, but I just felt like, how could they do that all these years? Right. And we have to consider at a time where there's so much vulnerability, right? And we're talking about K through 12 education. Children are vulnerable in regards to the messages they're taking in. And this is, we're setting the stage on things at this early age, and to not provide the truth it's unfortunate. And we got to acknowledge too that in providing the truth, we have to have supports in place for students, because hearing those truths are going to be very difficult for some students to accept and acknowledge and just to hear. So we have to beef up our mental health resources in schools for students. First of all, if schools are not thinking about this in light of us all experiencing the COVID pandemic, that mental health services need to be higher on the agenda, the budget, and things that nature, just off of the COVID pandemic alone, then off of the recent social injustice. Then we're going to add this. We have to be able to emotionally support students in hearing this information as well.
And I also think, I'm sorry, Dr. Bowling.
No, I was acknowledging.
Oh, okay.
I actually wanted to just say something if I could. Am I unmuted? I don't know.
You are unmuted. We can hear you.
I wanted to say something that spoke to the threat things that you were talking about now. I don't know if it relates to this question you just asked, but the other issue that I've seen when I've done workshops with white folks is that it's a threat to not only privilege for the people who have privilege, but for people who perceive that they don't have privilege. It's a threat to their perception of the promise of privilege because they're white. So once I was in a workshop and we were just doing that, who are you, and your identities. And one student said he was striving to be white. So there's this kind of expectation and promise of privilege that I think is threatened for people who don't feel privileged. You know, when you talk about privilege for white folks who don't feel privileged. So I think that's part of it as well.
Wow, 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 wow. That's such an interesting perspective. And you know, that certainly does go almost to the point. It argues the point of the need to have, you know, for the Amistad Act to be really, um, you know, to be developed and to become part of this, of the educational experience of all students, not just Black students, of course, but all students, because my goodness, when I hear what you just shared, it makes me think about the self-hatred that derives from being psychologically, socially, economically, politically invalidated, right, from within our society. And so therefore, because being Black is so meaningless, and
So
being
this is a
white,
white guy who said this.
oh, this is
This
a
is a
white
white
person.
guy who said this.
I need to even rethink that now. I was thinking that it was a Black person that made that statement. I'm sorry, I
This
didn't
was a
hear
white
that.
who said this. Yeah, I guess I wasn't explicit. This was a white student who said he was striving to be white because he felt that he didn't have the privilege, but he sort of, you know, he was supposed to have this privilege because he was a white person. So I think that's a threat to people, to white people as well. Sort of this threat that I have this promise that I'm white and I'm supposed to have privilege, I'm supposed to have all this stuff. And now all these other folks are coming in. How am I not, you know, now what's going to happen to this promise that I have? Being white, that I'm going to have, you know, I'm going to have this great life, superiority. I have all these other things.
Wow. Okay. That's interesting. He's white, but he's striving to be white. I mean, I certainly get the privilege piece because, right, there are poor whites in this country who are, you know, the doors are closed, right, to them as well. But interesting. I don't know. What did you hear in that share, and anything that you want to speak to within that? Either one of you, Dr. Prempe and Dr. Molina.
So I was just listening to Dr. Prempe, and I was thinking about, oh, and even just to answer your question too, I was honestly thinking that, you know, should we pull back the cover or the curtain and we do have that truth conversation? I honestly feel like people will go through what, like, the stages of grief almost, you know what I mean? I feel like there would be so much rationalization, there would be some explaining, some shock, some denial, some bargaining. I just feel like people will go through some of those stages because, and I don't even think that it would be just, you know, white people. I think it will also be people of color, because as you all were saying earlier, and I think Dr. Swift, what you were kind of getting at was kind of like, even as oppressed people within this country, being an American has something tied to that. Like, it has its own sort of privilege tied to that. You know what I mean? So it's just like, if we were to really, you know, talk about it and really get to the truth of the matter, I think that I think it will be a slow acknowledgement. I think there will be a lot of other things that will happen before, like I said, with the rationalization and the justification and things of that nature, before we actually started making progress and going forward. And then just also acknowledging within ourselves, you know, what that means and what that restructuring will look like. Because as I said earlier, we are diverse even within our own culture. So we also have to, you know, work with that as well. And, you know, where some people may feel comfortable or some people may have benefited from some of the privileges within this country, being a person of color. So, you know, you have some people, I want to say I saw the other day, a father who was at a board meeting talking about, like, you know, his degrees and things of that nature, and how he doesn't feel oppressed as a Black person. And, you know, if he wasn't, if he was oppressed, he wouldn't have 2 medical degrees or something of that nature. So I think that there will be a lot of work that will have to be done before we can move forward.
Wow. Go ahead, Dr. Prempe.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, Dr. Malinu, in the sense that we have to do it according to cognitive abilities and developmental stages, right? And how we're providing this information really to children in each category and as they progress from elementary school, middle school, and high school, right? And you know, really, like you're saying, bits and pieces of transparency and building on each other, just sharing the information as it is to a second grader is a little bit more tough than you would a high schooler who've been building upon this. The other thing that, you know, really you're touching on is the intersectionality, right? We recognize the different identities that we have and the privileges that may come with the different identities, right? So my experience as a Black woman that's a heterosexual is different from my counterpart that's a Black woman and homosexual, right? So we really have to look at all these different identities and how our experiences are different, right? And so it's important to acknowledge that as well, the intersectionality that comes up, and that's a part of understanding, this critical race theory and the oppressive systems and the truth behind it. It's all a part of that, acknowledging that, that's one of the key concepts of critical race theory. So it 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 behooves us to not further educate ourselves on these things and prepare students for the reality of the real world and things of that nature.
Yeah. So I didn't know if you had something that you wanted to say, Dr. Molyneux. It looked like your mouth was moving, but I wanted to go back to something that you said, Dr. Prempe. You were talking about having supports for students in the course of, implementing critical race theory and the Amistad Act, and it came to mind that, supports for students may be so. It seems like the parents may need the supports more, because what came up in my head is the news reports that I've been seeing and so forth. But parents are really like, crying and fighting, and legislators fighting, like, no, we can't do this critical race theory. This can't be taught. And parents are like, oh my God, I don't want my child, right? I don't want my child to be taught this stuff. So there's such a visceral, emotional, charge to this idea that, and then I thought, when you made the statement of student support, I feel like the students would probably have a lot less of a charge response to it. That I feel like our children in this country can handle the conversation if allowed to have the conversation. I'm not saying it would be easy. I'm not saying it would even be comfortable for all, but I feel like, as people get older and we get more set in our ways and buy into the false narratives that exist in this country, we become hardened in that way, and just, we cannot, the whole rug will be pulled from underneath our feet if we allow anything different to come into our sphere. And so I just, I don't even know if there's really a question here, but I'm just kind of acknowledging how there's such a fervor on the part of, legislators and parents. And I feel like it's less for students. If either or both of you can speak to what, your thoughts or your sense of things as it relates to students and their capacity to have these maybe challenging conversations. Maybe Dr. Molyneux, you have your feet on the ground, if you could kind of speak to this first. And then we're going to also wrap up, if you also can include any closing remarks that you may have as you address this last issue.
Mm-hmm. So I would definitely agree. I do feel like students are able to have these conversations, and oftentimes, as parents, and I say we, as myself as a parent, we want to protect our children, and we want to we just want to protect them. But at the end of the day, students are able to have these conversations, and I think that parents need to give their students or their children more credit than what they are giving. I think back to last year with everything that was going on with George Floyd and things of that nature, and how many young adults and teenagers were having difficult conversations with their parents about, well, these are the things I grew up knowing, and now I know better, so this isn't right. And it challenged the parents. And, maybe the parents, were open to the conversations. Maybe they weren't, maybe they, butt heads a little bit. But at the end of the day, the students were able to have the conversation. And I think, even if the students aren't able to bring forth the change in their own families, I think that, there is something to be said, because students are they are the future at the end of the day. They are the future. They are the next generation, and they're the ones who are going to be raising children one day and being able to have these conversations. So I think it is important that we do continue to integrate it into the curriculum, because even in integrating it within the curriculum, it's not so focused, because I think a lot of times, like, parents, might feel their impression of, critical race theory is that like students are sitting in a classroom and we're going through history of, like slavery, and we're just, they're like hours on end of like them just learning, Black history and things of that nature, when that's not necessarily the case. All we're asking for is, more integration of African American history and the contributions throughout time. So I think, even parents having an understanding of what that looks like, and like I said, integrating it into the lessons that students are receiving every day, I think that could help at help with putting help with putting parents' minds at ease about what their children are learning. Because at the end of the day, that is the reality of the country. As Dr. Prempe said, it's a harsh reality, but it's the reality nonetheless. And as Dr. Prempe said again, you don't want your students or your children to be going off into a world where they have no understanding at all, because as soon as you leave high school, you're hit with reality. And some of our students are hit with reality throughout. And that kind of goes back into like the equity and everything that we've been discussing today, addressing, what students are going through, what their experiences are, and meeting students where they are so that they have the supports within the school, so that they know that, this teacher understands me. Even if it's not every teacher, just having one person that a student feels connected to within the school can really change that student's trajectory and their future. So just having people in the school who understand, whether that's a mental health professional, whether that's a teacher, it could even be a security officer if they have security officers in the school. It could be, a custodial person. Everyone has someone that they feel connected to, they have, or that they can potentially feel connected to. So I think, bringing up these conversations, having these conversations, once again, getting back to the students, helps them understand that, but helps them know that there are people in this school who care about me. They care about my history. They care about where I'm going and who I'm going to be.
Yes, thank you for that. Thank you. And before you wrap us up, Dr. Prempe, was a comment that was made in the chat that it seems like if the Amistad Act was actually taken more seriously and actually implemented way back, then it possibly could have educated the children, which are now adults, and maybe empathy could have been a real thing today. And I couldn't agree more. Thank you for that comment. And Dr. Prempe, it's yours. Take us away.
That comment is spot on. It's really spot on. And that's why it's difficult of these lessons may be when we're integrating them. We have to start now, so that change can happen over time. And I'm glad you brought up the piece about the parents. I'm going to try to do this quickly, but the parents, it's important to understand their investment, right, in their child's future and things that nature. So I definitely understand when parents are reluctant when there's this new change that's going to happen in the curriculum and things of that nature. And they may feel as though it's a derailment from what's really needed, right? Like teach them math, teach them science, that's it. All that other stuff doesn't matter, but it does, right? If we go back to that example I provided of people in prominent positions working up to this point and then doing something that's discriminatory, racist, bias, and losing all that they've worked hard for, then we're going to realize, well, if they would have been more culturally aware and educated on different cultures and things of that nature, it would have helped that social piece that's just as important as academic excellence. And we also must understand that there's a generational gap. Now, thank goodness that there's children coming up that doesn't understand the concept of the first Black president. Like, what are you talking about, right? Yeah. First Black female president, what are you talking? These things are so like, well, why couldn't a Black person be president? Why couldn't it? And they don't understand that. And it's as beautiful as it is, there's also some naivety there. That now it's important for us to educate them on why this is significant. And that's what this Amistad Act, critical race theory, is all about, right? And so, we have to incorporate parents in these difficult conversations as well, because the conversation doesn't stop at school. They go home to their parents, and parents have to also be educated on how to have conversations around race to their children, regardless if your child is a person of color or not. White parents need to have the conversation with their children as well. It's beneficial for everyone. So, the thing that I keep saying over and over is the supports that's needed on a whole systemic level. You know, this can't be just the responsibility of teachers. This can't be the responsibility of school psychologists. This is everyone's responsibility in the system, from those that are head of schools to those on school boards. It is all of our responsibility to do what we need to do to make sure children are having well-rounded education that not only leads them to academic excellence, but also appropriate social skills to be well-rounded adults. You know, so we have to not, I think we're just so focused on academic excellence that we're neglecting the social piece that's just as important.
Yes, yeah, oh my gosh. So you said so much, and that's a perfect note to end on. Oh my God, you guys are all great. But before we wrap up, I really want to call our attention to a comment that was put in the chat by one of our scholars and allies, Dr. Ann Gregory, who mentions that she provides for us a resource, a professional development resource. It includes module on what acts can be experienced, anti-racist allyship. So if you would please grab that, if you haven't already, grab that link. I'm sure there's a lot there. I've grabbed it myself, and I'm looking forward to digging into it. Thank you for sharing that, and Gregory. And I want to just thank all of us for taking time out to be with us, to engage in this conversation. And hopefully you will take this conversation away from this space and continue it, because it was our desire in pulling this together to stimulate further conversation. We don't want this to end here. And I want to thank Dr. Prempe, Dr. Molyneux. Your thoughts, your critical analysis was so thought-provoking and so helpful. I'm so grateful for your being here today with us. Also, Congressman Kim, for the inspiration of pulling this together. So we're grateful for him as well. I don't know what happened to Mr. James Harris, who was the commissioner of the Amistad Act, who was supposed to be here, has extraordinary perspective and experience as it relates to the Amistad Act and some of the challenges that we're seeing and lifting it and making it a reality. But perhaps maybe that will be for next time, because everything happens as it should. I truly believe, and so it is what it is. And so thank you. With that, I want to thank everyone on behalf of the New Jersey Association of Black Psychologists. We appreciate your attendance. Thank you, and have a blessed day to all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank
Great
you.
presentation. Thank you so much, ladies.
Awesome. Thank you.
Great presentation. Have a great day.
Thank you.
As well.
Bye.
Sakina, can you hang on? I'm going
Yes.
to.
Yep, and just stop the recording.
I'm gonna stop. Yeah, that's why. Where is? Okay, here we go.